Questions orales, oral questions. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, this is an extremely sad day for Canadian taxpayers. The Prime Minister is forcing them to fix his failure on Canada's energy sector. It didn't have to be this way. Kinder Morgan was never asking for a handout. All they wanted was a clear path to get this project built, which is what this Prime Minister has failed to do. And now taxpayers on the hook for their mess. Can the Prime Minister give us a guarantee that these costs will exceed no more than $4.5 billion?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, the sheer audacity of the member opposite to talk about our absolute...
Order. Order. Members know that we have to be careful and that not do indirectly what we can't do directly, so I would avoid using the word that it creates to a name at the same time and to not use the name of a member. So I'd ask the Minister of Finance to try to avoid that.
Mr. Speaker, the audacity of the member opposite to talk about not getting a pipeline to market, which is what he and his party were unable to do, when we have stepped forward and said that we are going to take the decision to put a project in the national interest forward so that we can create the economic advantage that we're seeking. The economic advantage for Canada with $15 billion of advantage to our economy, 15,000 jobs. We, Mr. Speaker, are moving forward in the national interest for Canadians.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, before the 2015 election, pipelines in this country were built without taxpayers' money. They were applied for, they were approved, and they were completed without a cent of taxpayers' dollars. The only thing that has changed between then and now is that we have a Liberal government. Why is it that every time elements of our energy sector gets nationalized is when there's a Trudeau in the Prime Minister's office?
You're not making it easy for me. The same point applies. Members should avoid referring to someone who's currently a member by name. That could certainly be interpreted that way. The Honourable Minister of Finance. Order.
Speaker, let's evaluate what the member opposite just said. In the decade before 2015, not one pipeline was built to Tidewater. We know this as a fact. We are moving, Mr. Speaker, forward with a project that is going to ensure that we create an advantage for Canadians, an economic advantage that goes along with our overall plan to assure that the environment and the economy go hand in hand. This is in our national interest. It's creating jobs in Alberta, in British Columbia, and across our country.
Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Well, let's talk about where the advantage on this deal is going, Mr. Speaker. This Prime Minister is now cutting a check of taxpayers' money, $4.5 billion, going to shareholders in a Texas-based company. Now, this is in addition to the hundreds of billions of dollars that have already left Canada's energy sector. So, the Prime Minister claims he wants to attract investment into Canada. How much of the $4.5 billion that's being sent to Kinder Morgan will be spent and invested in Canada?
Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, with no business experience, I understand the member opposite might not understand what we're talking about. We're talking about a $4.5 billion investment in the assets of Kinder Morgan, creating long-term value for our country, because we know that's the right thing to do for our country. Order.
No, Hill will please come to order. Order. Members will note that it's possible, without breaking the strict rules, to say things that cause disorder, and I would ask members to be cautious in what they say in order to try to avoid creating disorder. The Honourable Minister of Finance has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, we are making an investment in Canada's future. We know that investing a fair amount of money into the assets of the Trans Mountain Pipeline and the expansion will create economic advantage to our country. We're creating jobs, 9,000 jobs in British Columbia, jobs across the country that are going to make a real difference for Canadian families. At the same time, we're adding up to $15 billion to our economy annually. We know this is important for our country.
The Honourable Member for Richmond-Athabasca. Mr. Speaker, it's not the Liberals who are supposed to be creating jobs, it's the private businesses who create jobs. They let the Trans Mountain project deteriorate for months, and now they're announcing that they're going to buy a pipeline with taxpayers' money. And worse still, Kinder Morgan never asked for a handout, and they never asked to be bought. The Prime Minister has once again failed. And so my question is simple. How much will this madness cost to Canadian taxpayers? The Honourable Minister of Finance. Mr. Speaker, we know that the Trans Mountain project is very important to the Canadian economy. It's in the national interest, and that is why we have invested in this project, to assure that there will be jobs, 15,000 jobs in Alberta and British Columbia, as well as an improvement in our national economy. The Honourable Member for Richmond-Athabasca. Mr. Speaker, when we see how the government and the Minister of Finance manages public finance, well, we should be worried, because there have been deficits year after year, and now the Liberals have decided to play construction expert, pipeline construction expert, with taxpayers' money. That's absolutely unacceptable. And that's another failure on the part of the Minister of Finance, the Prime Minister, and the government. So my question is simple. How much will Canadian taxpayers pay for this madness? The Honourable Minister of Finance. Mr. Speaker, we decided that it is very important to invest in the Trans Mountain project, and we know that with the $4.5 billion investment, we will be able to protect the value of the project and add value to the Canadian economy. This is a project that is in our national interest, and we will have an even greater economy with this investment. The Honourable Member for Rimouski-Nejet-Témiscouata-Libasque. Mr. Speaker, the government is going to spend $4.5 billion taxpayers' money, and they will take on all the risk. And this is a government that had committed to eliminating oil and gas subsidies. Why are the governments investing so much in oil and gas and so little in alternative energy? The Honourable Minister of Finance.
I want to be very clear. We've found a fair price for the assets of Trans Mountain. What we've done is ensure at the same time that there is no subsidy in this deal. What we're doing is trying to ensure that we can move forward in an economically prudent way to protect jobs, to create economic advantage for our country. We know this is in our best interests. We're going to continue to work to ensure that our natural resources can be brought to international markets.
Would remind the member for Beauport, Limoilou, Côte-de-Beaupré, Charlevoix, that they are not to speak out when someone has the floor, and they are not to cry out during these proceedings. The Honourable Member for Rimouski-Nejet-Témiscouata-Libasque. Mr. Speaker, what's clear is that we're the ones who talk about energy and the environment. They're the ones who don't. They're going to be investing $4.8 billion in a pipeline. There were only $3 billion in clean energy, Mr. Speaker. We have a serious problem with climate change, and if they took this seriously, they wouldn't invest in a pipeline. They would be investing in clean energy. Why are the Liberals so interested in investing in fossil fuels? Mr. Speaker, we continue with our approach to invest in our future. We know that the environment and the economy go hand in hand. That is very important. We have made investments in clean energy, but at the same time, we know that it is necessary to invest in this project to ensure that we will be able to protect the benefits to our economy for the future.
For Skeena Bulkley Valley.
Hey, anyone want to buy a 65-year-old leaky pipeline? No? Well, wait, it's located next to schools and parks and literally crosses hundreds of rivers. Well, the Liberals do. And they've somehow decided that paying $4.5 billion to buy an old pipeline and not tell us how much it's going to cost to build some illusionary new pipeline is somehow a good, quote, investment. When did Liberals actually decide that trampling over the rights of Indigenous peoples and putting our coast further at risk was somehow in the public interest?
Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, we approved this pipeline federally back in November 2016 after robust environmental assessment. The BC government approved this pipeline. We know that in this country, to get investments made, we need to have the rule of law. We cannot have a situation where provinces delay, create uncertainty, and make it such that investors don't actually want to invest in our country. We're moving forward to ensure this project moves forward. We know that eventually it can move to the private sector, which is what we will aspire to do following this decision today.
The member for Skeena Bulkley Valley.
$3.2 billion to provide safe drinking water for every kid living on reserve in this country. $4.5 billion to buy a 65-year-old pipeline. You have to ask yourself, what kind of priorities do these Liberals actually have? When a Texas oil company shows up and needs a bailout, these Liberals can't find a shovel big enough to pitch in. It won't stop First Nations in court, and it won't stop people in the street. So when exactly did Liberals decide to trump First Nations rights and title and protecting our coast, all in favor of some Texas oil company they want to help out?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I can only repeat that we think that it's critically important that we ensure that a project that's been federally and provincially approved can move forward. We've decided to purchase these assets because we know this is the way to ensure that this project actually happens and that we deal with the squabbles between provinces. We will move forward, reducing the risk in this project so that we can ensure that the economic advantages that we're seeking are achieved for Canadians.
The Honourable Member for Lakeland.
Mr. Speaker, today the Liberals bought Kinder Morgan out of Canada. It's a loss of nearly $8 billion that will be invested in other countries, and $4.5 billion is just the beginning of cost to taxpayers. For a year and a half, the Liberals failed to assert federal jurisdiction and to enforce the rule of law. Today, the Liberals are forcing Canadians to pay for their failures. Trans Mountain's opponents, they'll keep fighting to stop it and to kill pipelines in Canada. It's a catastrophic indictment on the Prime Minister. When will he finally admit that today's announcement is really Kinder Morgan divesting from Canada and Canadians paying for it?
Honourable Minister of Finance.
Speaker, what today's announcement is about our decision to step forward and ensure that we can actually get a project in the national interest done in this country. We know that the previous government was just unable to do that. So we've stepped forward with an approach that will ensure that happens by de-risking the project. It's in the national interest. We know, Mr. Speaker, it will create 15,000 jobs. We know it will create significant advantage for our economy. That's why we're moving forward to make sure that this project happens.
The Honourable Member for Lakeland.
But, Mr. Speaker, the reality is more than $100 billion in energy investment has left, and hundreds of thousands of Canadians have lost their jobs under these Liberals. Meanwhile, oil and gas is thriving around the world, especially in the U.S., Canada's biggest competitor. The Prime Minister is destroying future private sector energy opportunities, driving investment out of Canada into other countries, and sacrificing Canada's best interests. Now that the Liberals have chased away yet another private sector energy investor, how can Canadians possibly trust them to rebuild confidence in Canada?
Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Mr. Speaker, the member opposite is entitled to her opinions, but not to her own facts. The facts are that we've created 600,000 jobs in the last couple of years in this country. Canadians are doing significantly better because of the policies of this government. We know that we now need to move forward on a project that is advantageous for the country, but also for Alberta and British Columbia. In standing up for this project, what we're doing is ensuring that we will get a fair price for our resources, and we're doing it in a way that is respecting our approach to ensuring the environment is protected while we get proper prices for our resources.
Honourable member for Edmonton Riverbend.
Not long ago, Kinder Morgan, a private company, was a proud owner of a pipeline with plans to expand. Today, Kinder Morgan is divesting its Canadian assets to the taxpayer for $4.5 billion. The Liberals have screwed this deal up so badly that the only solution is to throw billions of taxpayer dollars at the project. And they still haven't told us what it will actually cost to build the expansion. Mr. Speaker, will the Finance Minister tell Canadians the total cost of this Liberal failure?
Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, not that long ago, about 2.5 years ago, this country had a government that was unable to get things done. What we've shown with our government is that when we find obstacles, when we find issues around provincial jurisdiction, that the federal government is willing to step forward in the national interest to make things happen. We've decided that a $4.5 billion investment, a fair value for these assets, is the right approach for us to make sure this happens, and we will work towards looking for a private sector solution as we de-risk the project.
The honourable member, order. Order. The honourable member for Calgary Nose Hill.
Mr. Speaker, 2.5 years ago, this country saw pipelines being built without a cent of taxpayer dollars going into a socialized, nationalized energy program. Mr. Speaker, Kinder Morgan was prepared to invest billions into the Canadian economy, and that is gone because the Prime Minister politically destabilized the investment climate in Canada. We have no idea how much this pipeline is going to cost to build or how it's going to be built by a man who hasn't successfully managed to do much of anything. Why should the Canadians pay for his failures?
I would ask the member for Don Valley East and others not to be speaking up when someone else has the floor. The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, we need to call fiction when fiction happens. What did not happen in the last government? There were no pipelines bringing resources to international markets. The reality is we accept a lower price for our natural resources in this country because... Apparently there's a problem with the...
Order.
For the moment. Is the interpretation now working? Is it now? It is now working. Excuse me. Order. I'm going to have to ask the Honourable Minister to restart.
Mr. Speaker, I was talking about a fictional story from the opposite side of the House. Their fictional story is that they got pipelines done. The reality is not one pipeline to international markets. We know this to be true. The reason for the discount on Canadian resources is because of a lack of access to international markets. It's why the Trans Mountain expansion is so important. It's why we're moving forward to invest in those assets. It's why we're de-risking the project to make sure it gets done for Canadians.
The Honourable Member for Chilliwack Hope.
These Liberals cancelled the Northern Gateway pipeline. They dithered on the Keystone XL pipeline. They killed the Energy East pipeline.
Right.
They've talked down our world-class energy regulator and have told audiences, both foreign and domestic, that they want to phase out the energy sector and the jobs that go with it. They botched the Trans Mountain project so badly that they've turned a multi-billion-dollar private sector investment into a multi-billion-dollar bill for Canadian taxpayers.
Yes.
Why should Canadians be forced to pay billions to Kinder Morgan to cover for this Prime Minister's embarrassing incompetence?
Honourable Minister, order. The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Great.
Order.
We are buying assets that have value. These assets, of course, will enable us to ensure that we get this pipeline expansion built. We know that this is important for Canadians. We know that's important for Canadians from the members part of the country, because we're going to create jobs. We're also going to create economic wealth for our entire country. Mr. Speaker, when we're working in the national interest, we are going to move forward with an approach that absolutely deals with uncertainties so that we can get this back into the private sector.
Honourable member for Chilliwack Hope.
They're buying assets, Mr. Speaker. They're nationalizing a private pipeline. Yesterday, there were protesters willing to stop this project. Yesterday, the BC government was in court fighting against this pipeline. Yesterday, there were Liberal MPs from BC opposed to this project. Today, nothing has changed except taxpayers are $4.5 billion poorer. Will nationalizing the pipeline actually get Liberal members of Parliament from BC to back it?
Yeah. Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, let's evaluate where we are today. For months, the members opposite have been complaining that the Trans Mountain pipeline expansion was not happening. Today, we announced that we are moving forward to ensure the expansion of the Trans Mountain pipeline. So, what have we got? Are they upset that we're going to be able to get our resources to international markets, create value for Canadians? Or are they upset about the fact that we're going to be able to create more jobs for Canadians? Mr. Speaker, it's one of the two, or perhaps both, but it doesn't matter because our resolve is to get this project done because it's in Canada's best interest.
The Honourable Member for Jonquière. Mr. Speaker, the Auditor General was clear. The implementation and management of the Phoenix Pay system has been an incomprehensible failure. Those in charge preferred to keep to their budget and their deadlines rather than implementing a system that worked. There were warnings coming from everywhere, but they were ignored by those in charge. The result? Once again, workers who are still suffering the fallout of this disaster. When will this government launch a public inquiry so that we can finally know what actually happened? The Honourable Minister of Public Services. Mr. Speaker, I would like to thank the Auditor General for his report. We accept his report and we accept his recommendations. Today's report reminds Canadians the reality of those 10 years under the Conservative government. This has been one of the most studied systems in the government in the history of Canada. And after considering Phoenix, the Auditor General published 2 reports, and the government also asked for third-party reports. It has also been the subject of study on the part of a parliamentary committee. We know that this was a failure on the part of the Conservative government.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure you can get any clearer than the Auditor General. It calls the Phoenix fiasco an incomprehensible failure of project management and oversight. There was no oversight in the decision to implement Phoenix by these Liberals, even though they knew it had significant problems. Executives were more focused on meeting the budget and the timeline than actually delivering a working paying system. Following the devastating report, will the government finally compensate all workers and implement a public inquiry to ensure that this never happens again?
Well, Minister of Public Services.
Mr. Speaker, I do want to thank the Auditor General for his report, and we are accepting all of his recommendations. Mr. Speaker, this is one of the most studied government projects in the history of the Government of Canada. We have 2. We called in the Auditor General and had 2 reports performed by the Government of Canada, third-party reports. We know very clear what happened, Mr. Speaker. The former government treated this as a cost-cutting measure instead of the government-wide initiative that it so clearly was. They set this project up to fair, and now they are paying the consequences publicly. Shame on all of them.
Order. Order. I remind members, quoting the member for Calgary, Signal Hill, another member for Abbotsford, another member for Parry Sound, Muskoka, the time to speak is when they have the floor. You did earlier. L'honorable député de Louis.
The Honourable Member for Louis Saint Laurent. Mr. Speaker, the Liberals' record on energy is catastrophic. Since they've been in power, We've lost 125,000 jobs in the energy sector and more than $60 billion in investment. And what's their miracle Band-Aid solution? To go and get money out of the pockets of taxpayers and give it to a Texas-based oil company, $4.5 billion. So my question is for the Minister of Finance. What's the point in having experience from Bay Street if you make such bad decisions? Honourable Minister of Finance.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Speaker, there's always a benefit to having experience, and what we would say is that we had a not very good experience at all with the Conservative government. Actually, they did nothing. That was their experience. We have decided that it is very important to have the strength and the courage to invest in a project that is in the national interest. We must make that investment now, and in that way, we will be able to engage the private sector in the future with a working project, and a project that is working to the benefit of all Canadians. The Honourable Member for Louis Saint Laurent. Well, that's quite unbelievable. $4.5 billion in taxpayers' money for a Texas-based company. But that is the reality of this Liberal government. What is the Liberal government's record? Well, since they've been in power, American investment has dropped by 50% in Canada, but Canadian investment in the States has increased by 66%. Really? Seriously, how can the Minister of Finance say that he himself is an expert in finance? The Honourable Minister of Finance. Mr. Speaker, here are the facts. In 2017, there was an increase in investment in Canada of 8%. That is the fact. And we know that it is very important to have a resource sector that will work for us in the future, and that is why we have decided to invest in the Trans Mountain project. It's very important for the future of Canadians, and so that our economy can benefit from that $15 billion every year, and so that Canadians who live in British Columbia and Alberta and throughout the country can benefit from the project.
For Carleton.
Let's be clear about one thing. This $4.5 billion handout of taxpayers' money will not build 1 inch of new pipeline. Right. In fact, every penny will go into the pockets of a Texas oil company, which it will then take to build pipelines outside of Canada in competition with our industry. Exactly. How did we go from that company wanting to invest $7 billion in Canada to sending $4 billion of taxpayers' money out of this country?
Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, we are buying... Mr. Speaker, we are buying the assets of Kinder Morgan, the Trans Mountain pipeline assets that's currently there, and the opportunity to expand that pipeline. These assets create value. So we are buying assets that create value, and what we're going to do is create more value by assuring that the project gets done. These advantages are going to help our sector, our natural resources sector. They're also going to help our broader economy and create jobs across the country. We know it's the right thing to do. We'll get this project done.
Honourable Member for Carleton.
What he did is spend over $4 billion on a pipeline that Canadians have had for over 60 years. We get absolutely nothing new with this except a lot of financial risk. And $7 billion that was going to be invested by a private sector company has now vanished into thin air. So a very simple question. How much will it cost taxpayers to actually build the expansion, or is this all just a pipe dream?
Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, fundamental to what we are doing is actually buying assets. So those assets were owned by someone else so that we can actually make sure this project happens. Of course, we want to make sure that we get the appropriate value for Canadians. So there is commercially sensitive information that as we look towards how we might move this project into the private sector, that we need to recognize as commercially sensitive. Canadians will have a full understanding and transparency of this project, and what it will do is create advantages for our economy and for jobs across the country. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Windsor West.
Mr. Speaker, we now have reports of two of Canada's largest banks saying hackers have breached the private information of up to 90,000 Canadian consumers. This is just months after the data breaches at Uber, Equifax, and Bell Canada, affecting tens of thousands of Canadians and their private information. The European Union took action and implemented new data protection this last week. And what did this Liberal government do? Absolutely nothing. In fact, Mr. Speaker, this government has not even followed through on basic recommendations. When will they actually take action to protect Canadian consumers with a digital Bill of Rights and stop letting these companies get...
The Honourable Minister of Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, the member full well knows that we brought changes to the regulations to update PIPEDA. PIPEDA is the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act. And these regulations and these changes are very important because if there's any private entity, a bank or otherwise, if there's any lost or stolen data, they must report that immediately to the individual and to the Privacy Commissioner. Failure to do so will lead to an infraction fine of $100,000, Mr. Speaker, per data breach. That's a significant cost per data breach, and that's an important signal we're sending to protect the privacy of Canadians.
Député de Trois-Rivières.
The honourable member for Trois-Rivières. Mr. Speaker, in the absence of a real charter of air passengers' rights, an American firm has told us that Canadian travellers are being fleeced to the tune of $65 million a year. Now, the government strategy is well known. When the Minister of Transport is unable to make a decision, he calls for consultations. But we have an example in the European Charter, and the Minister has already taken a position by refusing amendments in the House and in the Senate. Mr. Speaker, does the Minister think he can take passengers for a ride? The Minister, Mr. Speaker, Canadians know that when they buy a plane ticket, they have a right to a certain level of treatment. And this is why we intend to create a regime for passengers' rights. But we're also going to consult Canadians. There are 13 million people a year who take the plane. And our department has initiated the process as of yesterday.
Canadians elected our government in part because of our commitment to help strengthen and grow our economy, to help the middle class, and to create well-paying jobs for Canadians. Can the Minister of Finance share with this House how today's decision to purchase the Trans Mountain Pipeline and related assets will help to uphold this commitment?
The Honourable Minister of Finance. Order.
Mr. Speaker, it's great that we have at least one Alberta Member of Parliament who's supporting Albertans. What I know is that the member from Edmonton Centre and the other members from the Liberal Party support this project because we recognize that what we're bringing to Albertans is huge advantage. Advantage in terms of their economy.
Order. The honourable member for Carleton will come to order. There's far too much noise in the House. Members and I are having trouble hearing the questions and the answers, especially the answers. Members will come to order. Order. Honorable député de Bellechasse.
The honourable member for Bellechasse, Lévis. Mr. Speaker, like the Liberal Prime Minister, the Minister of International Development says that illegal migrants are welcome. But this is not just for businesses and legal immigrants who have been waiting for years to work legally in my riding in places like Sainte-Justine, Sainte-Claire, and Saint-Anselme. They want legal immigrants. When will the government stop this illegal flow of migrants at the border? The Minister of Transport, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to put a question to the Conservatives, to the Harper Conservatives, because yesterday the member for Milton mentioned that 600 illegal migrants crossed the border, and I'd like to know where they got this information because I don't have the same figures. And yet, the honourable member for Milton mentioned 600 people last week. Now, we're not allowed to repeat falsehoods in this House, so where did he get this figure of 600 people? The honourable member for Bellechasse-les-Échemins-Lévis. Mr. Speaker, it's simple. We have illegal immigrants. And yet, the government keeps talking about cutting the budget of the Canadian Border Services Agency by $302.6 million and cutting the budget of enforcement agents by $30 million. If the Prime Minister is serious, when will he stop this illegal flow of migrants? The Honourable Minister. Well, the Harper Conservatives cut into this area by millions of dollars, and I've heard enough, I think, from one of the honourable members. If you continue yelling, people cannot hear answers. The Honourable Minister of Transport, Mr. Speaker, we're continuing to work in cooperation with the provinces and the United States to plan for these issues. We will be discussing irregular migrants. Now, the Conservatives are continuing to fearmonger, but we are taking concrete action to deal with the situation. The Honourable Member for Mégantic-l'Érable. Mr. Speaker, the Liberals make splendid speeches, but when it comes to supply management, there's a problem. And there's a problem in renegotiating NAFTA. Now, the Prime Minister is supposed to be the defender of our dairy producers. What part of the supply management does he intend to concede to Americans within the NAFTA renegotiation?
Our government supports and is committed to maintaining supply management. This has been a clear position through the NAFTA negotiation, and every member of our government fully supports the Prime Minister and this government's policy. This is the opposition to the Conservative Party, whose innovation critic, appointed by the Leader of the Opposition, is opposed to supply management. He even detailed the reasons why in a book that the Leader of the Opposition would not allow him to publish. Mr. Speaker, on this side of the House, we all support supply
management. Order, please. The Honourable Member for Mégantic-l'Érable. Mr. Speaker, who did the Prime Minister hire to advise him on this issue? Simon Beauchemin, who is an ardent adversary of supply management. His vision brooks no argument. For him, supply management is regressive. Our leader and the official opposition are clear. No new concessions to the Americans. Can the Minister of Agriculture say that we will not concede 1 litre of milk, 1 egg, 1 chicken more to the Americans?
The Honourable Parliament, order. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary for Canada-U.S. Relations. Order.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And to be clear, we will always defend supply management. Now, certain members of the official opposition, including the member for Beauce, who may be against supply management, but I'd ask the Honourable Member for Mégantic-l'Érable to listen to the answer. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our position on this issue is clear. We've always defended this system, and we will do so on each and every opportunity, including the NAFTA negotiations.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. CP rail workers can go on strike legally as soon as tonight. And those workers, like all Canadian workers, have the right to free and fair collective bargaining. Now, I know the minister's addressed this issue before in the House, but she has not clearly stated that her government will not use back-to-work legislation to unilaterally end the strike. So I'm giving her that opportunity now and asking if she'll commit to those workers today on the record that she will not use back-to-work legislation to end the strike.
Mr. Employment and Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as of today, the parties continue to negotiate at the table to get a deal. I've spoken with the employer, I've spoken with both labour unions, and they continue to have those conversations. We're there, the Federal Mediation Service is with them, and we encourage them to continue to work towards a deal. Thank you.
Député de Berthier-Maskin.
The Honourable Member for Berthier-Masquinongé. Mr. Speaker, we learned that one of the PM's close advisors has already fought to abolish supply management. This advisor is today playing a very important role in the NAFTA negotiations. This is really frightening. It sounds positively conservative. The government says it wants to defend and protect supply management, but hires people who want to abolish it. Now, I have a question. Can the government confirm that they will defend our supply management system? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, our position on supply management is clear and will remain clear. We have always defended supply management before and during these negotiations for NAFTA. It has worked in an excellent way for Canadians, and protecting supply management is important for all of us, for Canadian consumers, and for our industry. We will always defend supply management.
Falls.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to inform the government that this week is Victim and Survivors of Crime Week. Now, I know the Liberals have made it clear that victims have not been a priority of theirs in this last 2.5 years. And, of course, the latest example is C-75, which reduces the penalties for many serious crimes, including the abduction of a child under 14, forced marriage, participation in terrorist groups and criminal organizations, and many others. Mr. Speaker, is there any hope that this government can change their philosophy before the next election and start putting victims first? Can they do that?
Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to stand up to speak about Bill C-75, which is going to address delays and efficiencies in the criminal justice system. The member opposite spoke about the reclassification provisions in terms of reforms that are proposed. It is simply untrue that we are changing the sentencing regime. We are hybridizing offenses, but providing prosecutors with additional tools. And I'd like to ask my friend across the way, what does he feel about the provisions in terms of intimate partner violence, where we are supporting those victims of sexual assault and domestic violence in this bill? Does he not support that?
The Honourable Member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Mr. Speaker, while the Liberals have failed to appoint a victims ombudsman after 6 months, when the prisoners ombudsman position became vacant, they filled it immediately. When it comes to filling a position to protect the rights of criminals, the Liberals couldn't move fast enough. When it comes to filling a position to protect the rights of victims, the Liberals are AWOL. Why do the Liberals always put the rights of criminals ahead of victims?
Minister of Justice.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And certainly we are taking a broad approach to review of the criminal justice system, a balanced approach that supports victims of crime, that ensures that the offenders are held to account, and that promotes public safety. We are committed to appointing a new federal ombudsperson for victims of crime. We are presently undertaking a review and identifying a potential candidate. This is a priority for our government, and we will move forward at the nearest and closest time with the most appropriate and skilled individual.
The Honourable Member for Beauport, Côte-Beaupré, Île d'Orléans, Charlevoix. This is the National Week for Victims of Crime. People have to understand that the position of Ombudsman for Victims of Crime has been vacant for 7 months. But we've learned that the government filled the position of Correctional Services Investigator last January. Now, why have the Liberals not given a stronger voice to victims of crime by naming an independent ombudsman, appointing someone so that they can be protected?
Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I said, our government is committed to ensuring that the criminal justice system is safe in communities, ensures and respects victims of crime, and holds offenders to account. Our government is committed to a renewed approach, as we have said, in terms of the appointments process based on openness, transparency, and merit. The process for the appointment of the new federal ombuds victims of crime is presently ongoing and remains a high priority to me. The position will be filled as soon as possible at the conclusion of this process.
Honourable Member for Long Range Mountains.
Mr. Speaker, this week is Tourism Week in Canada. It's a chance to highlight the incredible work and phenomenal success of our tourism industry. So from coast to coast to coast, our industry is world class, and it's created over 26,000 jobs just since 2015. Culinary tourism in my province of Newfoundland and Labrador is some of the best in the country, as we have seen from Chef Ross Larskin's recent win on Top Chef Canada. Can the Minister of Small Business and Tourism please tell this House what our government is doing to make 2018 the best year for Canadian tourism?
Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, last year we launched Canada's new tourism vision. Budget 2017 stabilized Destination Canada's budget at $95.5 million per year. We announced $8.6 million to grow Canada's Indigenous tourism industry. We are enhancing tourism data collection by providing StatsCan $13.5 million over 5 years. 2017 was the best year ever for the tourism industry, with over 20 million international visitors spending $21 billion across our great country. Together with the member of Long Range Mountains, and I hope all members and all Canadians, we will build on this success because our investments are working. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for Milton.
Mr. Speaker, this question is for the Minister of Labour. Mr. Speaker, we know that a CP Rail strike may be happening this weekend, this evening actually, and we know as well that Via Rail has already cancelled passenger service because of the operational uncertainty. We know as well that commuting services in Montreal, Vancouver, and Toronto could be affected. Now, in the past, an agreement had been sought and actually adhered to with respect to the provision of these services by Teamsters and CP Rail. Can the minister tell me if she actually got her job done and secured these agreements so that people can get to work tomorrow?
Minister of Employment and Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're not going to take any lessons from the Harper government on labor relations.
Here, here.
Let me just remind the member opposite what experts had to say about how the previous government handled labor disputes. Highly unusual, a double-edged sword for employers, wholesale departure from the rules of collective bargaining, destabilizing, abuse of the provisions in the Canada Labour Code. They didn't understand how the system works. Listen, we support a fair and balanced process because this is what's right for the Canadian economy, for workers and for employers. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Nanaimo Ladysmith.
To stop oil spills and protect jobs, the BC Chamber of Commerce on Saturday endorsed the same abandoned vessel solutions that I brought to this House. 36,000 businesses joined hundreds of coastal communities who urged the Transport Minister to include their solutions in their fix, like vessel turn-in and recycling. Despite years of coastal advocacy, the Liberals' Bill C-64 still doesn't include coastal solutions to deal with thousands of wrecks off our coast, and they've dragged anchor on resuming the debate. So why is this government leaving abandoned vessels on our coast for another?
The Honourable Minister of Transport.
Mr. Speaker, we're extremely proud of Bill C-64, which addresses a long-standing issue which has not been taken care of by previous governments. That is the question of abandoned and derelict vessels. We've come up with an excellent bill. In fact, it has been through the committee, which my colleague has had the chance to participate in. We're very proud of this bill, and we hope that the NDP and the Harper Conservatives are going to support this bill as we move it through report stage and third reading and then quickly on to the Senate.
The Honourable Member for Marc-Aurèle-Fortin. Mr. Speaker, last March 1st, there was a tragedy in my riding of Marc-Aurèle-Fortin when young Athéna Gervais lost her life after consuming a very sugary, high alcohol content drink. My question is for the Minister of Health. Can she update the House on the action Health Canada intends to take to make sure this never happens again? The Honourable Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague, the member for Marc-Aurèle-Fortin, for his question and his work on this file. A tragedy like this is another tragedy too many. We are going through a process of consultations in order to find a framework for these drinks, dealing with these drinks. We will soon have recommendations. I hope people will participate in these consultations, and I'd like to thank the member for his work on this issue.
Mr. Speaker, the Liberals allowed Canadians to believe Cambridge Analytica whistleblower Christopher Wylie, working in the Liberal leader's office in 2009, was terminated because his electoral data manipulation was too invasive. In testimony to the Ethics Committee today, Mr. Wylie said that wasn't why his contract ended. In a 2016 email to the UK's Leave movement in the Brexit referendum, Wylie said the outcome could be influenced with psychographic micro-targeting and that he was working on a similar project for a major Canadian political party. Mr. Speaker, who's telling the truth?
The Honourable Minister of Democratic Institutions.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable colleague for his question. As my honourable colleague knows, the Prime Minister has tasked me and our government to ensure that we defend Canada's next federal election against cyber threats. It's also important that we ensure that we are looking for new ways to deal with data and digital breaches. That is why in Bill C-76 we have a provision against the malicious use of computers, and I look forward to working with all colleagues in this House to ensure that we do what's necessary as these new technologies evolve to ensure the integrity of our elections. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Député de Manicouagan.
The Honourable Member for Manicouagan. Mr. Speaker, the Trudeau government is poised to buy the Trans Mountain Expansion project. Kinder Morgan is dropping it because it's so risky, a project that is a constant menace for the environment, a project that British Columbians and Indigenous nations don't want. These economic, environmental, social risks are something Quebec doesn't want either. Will the government refund Quebecers their share of the $4.5 billion so they can use this money and invest it in renewable energies? The Honourable Minister of Finance. Mr. Speaker, we know that an investment in Trans Mountain is very important. It's important for the national interest and also for the future of our economy. It will help our economy to grow, but we can also add other things in British Columbia, Alberta, and other places. This is in the national interest. We need this project. It is highly important for our future.
Mr. Speaker, the Government of Canada has apparently just bought a pipeline from Kinder Morgan for $4.5 billion that they bought for $550 million. But my question is, there are 15 different court cases right now, Indigenous rights cases, environmental group cases, and municipal cases. When the Federal Court of Appeal rules, if the court rules that the permits are invalid, what is the government's plan? Will it restart the environmental assessment process and restart consultations?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Speaker, the honourable member asking the government to speculate hypothetically on what a court may or may not say. We could look retrospectively about what courts have said, and even very recently, the BC Supreme Court has spoken about consultation and actually sided with the proponent. But it's not a good idea for us to speculate on what a future court might say on a case that has nothing to do with the ones that have been decided already. We do know that through this process, there was unprecedented consultation with Indigenous people, 43 communities who signed on to benefit agreements, 33 in Britain.
Honourable Member for Regina Louvain.
Mr. Speaker, as you may have heard, the government announced today that it will buy the Trans Mountain Pipeline. Far be it from the CCF to question nationalization. But can the Minister confirm that the new federal Crown Corporation will honour the existing contract to buy 75% of the project's steel from Regina and make every effort to procure the remaining 25% from Canadian mills?
Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I can confirm that we have purchased the assets, and it is our intent that this project moves forward in a commercial fashion. We will be seeking the approach that makes most sense, which will include honouring contracts that have already been put forward. What we will seek to do, Mr. Speaker, is then move towards consideration of a private sector solution at the appropriate time, creating the value that we want to create for Canadians.